Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski. What I wanted to do was to create kind of a video lecture that'll might help you understand Ursula Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. The Ones Who Walk from Omelas is a great story, but sometimes students can find it really challenging, right? At the start of the story, Le Guin uses a lot of details that can overwhelm the story, but when the big event happens, everything changes and the story becomes really kind of interesting and engaging. I'm also going to argue that The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a great example of mythic criticism. So let me talk about a little bit about The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Notice that sometimes when I'm teaching in a ground class, I ask students, imagine you're making it into a movie. Where would you set The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, right? What city would you place this in? So we know some things about Omelas, right? We know that it's a small town. I always imagine if I were to set it someplace in Italy or Lake Tahoe, because it's this beautiful, picturesque city where everyone is happy. And basically you can do anything that your heart desires. So sometimes I think you might set the story in Las Vegas, or you might set it in Disneyland, right? Because Disneyland is the happiest place on earth. You could even set it in Amsterdam, right? But notice Omelas is this kind of picturesque, beautiful city where everyone is happy and you can do anything that your heart desires. Everyone is happy. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what does that mean that you can do anything your heart desires, right? Well, there are talks about, there are orgies, there's talks about people doing drugs, but there's no judgment, right? Everyone can do whatever their heart desires. And then as we get into the story, we hear that, and my original memory of the story is a little bit different from when I read it the first time, because the first time I read the story, I thought it was you had to go to spot X. And when you went to spot X, there was Y. But my students all point out it's optional. You don't have to go to spot X. You know about spot X. And if you choose to go there, there is Y. And I know that kind of wording might kind of confuse students, but I like my original memory of the story better, because if you have to go at least once, it means you're invested. I don't like the idea that it's optional, right? Because then you're a little hands off, you're a little invested. But if you go to spot X, and there is Y, I always think of X could be a couple of things. It could be the basement, it could be the dungeon, it could be the cellar, right? It could be the town square. But whenever you get to spot X, right, there, let's just call it the basement, right? And what's at Y? Well, if you open up the basement cellar, there is a suffering child. And notice, they say there is absolutely nothing that you can do to help that poor suffering child. If you do anything to help that poor suffering child, society will crumble. And if we look at this poor child, right, it's dirty, it's filthy. We don't know how old it is, right? I don't even know if it talks anymore. Sometimes it moans, but here is what society says: there's absolutely nothing you can do to help this child, because if you do anything to help this child, society will crumble. And notice some people just break down and cry. Some people kick the child. And then some people are so shocked and so mortified, they walk away. And, I always have a question of, do the people who walk away, do they actually make a difference? Do they actually have an impact? And sometimes classes are split, right? But I always think, what difference does it make if you leave? Why not help the child? And wouldn't the story be better if, the people who left the town, they went to the next town over and they found Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they got in a helicopter and they jumped out with grenades and they rescued the child to save it, right? But here's the thing, even if they did that, society would crumble, because there's nothing you can do to help that poor suffering child. And sometimes students say, hey, the people who do leave, they do make a difference, because they're not going to participate in a society where the greater good is a suffering child. Now, the key to understanding Omelas is to ask, what does the child symbolize? What does the child represent? And sometimes students come up with the best ideas, but notice there is textual evidence to support this claim, right? There's textual evidence to say if the child suffers for you, the child suffers for your happiness. Well, if that's the case, then the child really becomes a symbol of a Christ-like figure, right? The child then becomes Christ. But I tell you that students actually have the best interpretations of Omelas, because I one time was teaching it in a summer school class, and I had a bunch of students who went to school at UC San Diego or San Diego State, and they said that they thought the child represented Mexico. And I said, well, how did you come up with that idea? Well, they said, hey, look, you're a freshman, you're 18 years old, you go to school at San Diego State, and you want to party. Well, you're not legal enough, but what you can do is you can just cross the border, go into Tijuana, and you can party and drink all you want. And then you can just cross right back across the border. And they said, San Diego is one of the most prosperous cities, probably in the United States, right? Whereas Tijuana is one of the most poorest cities in all of Mexico. So that's pretty ingenious, right? That the city might represent, or the child might represent Mexico, or might represent poverty and suffering. Then I one time had students say that they thought the child represented Nike. And I said, Nike, like the shoe company? And they said, yeah, because if you think about it, Nike makes a good product, right? Nike makes a popular shoe. And if you think something like the LeBron James shoes, they probably cost anyway, let's just assume that they cost from anywhere to like $200, $300. Some people might spend more than that. But where does Nike make its product? It makes its product using sweatshop labor, right, in China. So that's absolutely genius, right, that the child could represent Nike. So students come up with some of the best ideas, and that's why I always like to know what students think possibly that the child could symbolize, right? And then I one time had a student, and this is really interesting, that they actually ask a better question, right? They said, what if you looked into the basement and you looked a little bit different, looked a little bit deeper into the basement, and what if in the basement there were more children, right? And that's really creepy, but then notice, then the child becomes rhetoric, right? Because if there are more children in the basement, then there's no reason why we can't save the child, right? Because if you just have another child to replace it, because if you think about the condition of that child, it's suffering, it's dirty, it's filthy, it's got sores on it, it's not gonna live very long, right? So are they replacing the child? Because let's just assume that you can't do anything to help the child, and giving its condition, it's going to maybe live for a year. Well, if we can't do anything to help the child is going to die in a year, then that means society is going to fall apart and crumble. So the child can then become a symbol of rhetoric, right? The rhetoric that our government tells us, the lies that our governments tell us. And then there's an argument that says that the child might represent gas or oil because it's covered in kind of a level of like black grime and filth. And if you think about it, if you turned on the TV right now and they said, hey, oil and gas is going to run out in a year, what would happen to society? Society would crumble because we're so based on gas and oil. So I wanted just to create this lecture to kind of give you some ideas of what the story, kind of give you ideas of the story of the plot, because it can be a kind of a difficult story to understand. But I think once you get to the child, everything changes. And the key is to ask, what does the child symbolize? So I'll look forward to seeing what you have to say in the discussion board question and what you think of Omelas. And then remember, I'm going to argue that mythically, we can link Omelas to the lottery.